It arrived on a Tuesday. Not the telegram. That had come weeks earlier, delivered by a man in uniform who knocked on the front door and said nothing beyond what the paper said. The family had already done the crying they could do standing up. They had already moved through the first terrible silence, the kind that fills a house when the person who used to fill it is gone. What arrived on that Tuesday was a brown paper parcel, modest, tied with string, bearing a return address in Kansas City, Missouri. Inside it was everything he had left behind. By the time the United States entered the Second World War, American military planners had already learned a brutal lesson from the first, that the families of fallen soldiers deserved more than a telegram and a grave marker on foreign soil. They deserved whatever small pieces of a man had survived the war alongside him. The wallet, the photographs, the letter he had been writing when orders moved him forward, the Bible if he carried one, the pocket knife, the wedding ring. To make that possible, the Army built a system, quiet, methodical, profoundly human, that most Americans would never hear about. It was called the Army Effects Bureau, and it operated out of the Kansas City Quartermaster Depot in Missouri. Its job was to receive, inventory, launder, sort, and ultimately return to American families every personal item belonging to every soldier who did not come home. No other army in the history of the world had attempted anything quite like it, and the scale of what it faced was staggering. More than 407,000 American service members were killed during the Second World War. Every one of them, by Army regulation, was entitled to have their personal effects collected, protected, cataloged, and sent home. That meant hundreds of thousands of small brown parcels, hundreds of thousands of inventories, typed or written by hand. Hundreds of thousands of decisions, by men in the field, by clerks in Kansas City, by officers who had to look at what a man had been carrying and determine what his mother could bear to receive. It began at the point of loss. When a soldier was killed, the men nearest him, often under fire, often exhausted, often grieving, were responsible for collecting his personal effects. His identification tags were removed. One went with the body. One was kept for the records. His pockets were turned out. His kit was gathered. Whatever he had on him, the photographs he had folded into his breast pocket, the letters from home he had been rereading for weeks, the foreign coin he had picked up as a keepsake, all of it was placed into a personal effects bag. The bag was sealed. An inventory was attached. The commanding officer of the unit then had an additional, quietly painful duty to perform. He was required to examine the effects to ensure that nothing inside would cause what the regulations called additional heartache for the next of kin. Love letters from a woman who was not the wife, photographs that should not follow a man home, anything that would turn grief into something more complicated. These were removed, not destroyed arbitrarily, documented, accounted for, but set aside. The Army was trying to protect the living from one more blow. Then the sealed bag began its journey. From the battlefield or the aid station or the airfield, it traveled by courier, by ship, by military post, making its way, often across thousands of miles of ocean, to 601 Hardesty Avenue in Kansas City, Missouri. The Army Effects Bureau. There, a workforce of Army clerks and civilian employees handled the incoming parcels with a care that bordered on ceremony. Soiled clothing was laundered. Government tissue equipment, helmets, weapons, field gear, was separated out and returned to the Army. Foreign currency was converted into U.S. dollars and deposited to the credit of the next of kin. Any cash or negotiable checks were banked on the family's behalf. Every remaining personal item, every photograph, every letter, every small civilian object that had traveled with a soldier through training camps and troop ships and combat zones, was inventoried by hand. Then the package was held. It waited in Kansas City until the Bureau received a shipping order from the family or until the appropriate time had passed, and then it was sent. The average soldier during the Second World War wrote 6 letters a week. 6. When you consider that there were at times more than 8 million Americans in uniform, the volume of correspondence moving back and forth across the Atlantic and the Pacific was almost impossible to comprehend. In 1945 alone, the Army Postal Service handled more than 2 billion pieces of mail. More than 1 billion additional pieces moved through the V-mail system. Letters written on government forms, photographed onto microfilm, flown overseas, and printed out at a fraction of their original size, to save the cargo space for ammunition and fuel. Every one of those letters was a lifeline. The average delivery time was 1 to 4 weeks, which meant that when a man was killed in action, his family often continued to receive his letters for weeks afterward, cheerful letters, homesick letters, ordinary letters full of requests for socks and news about the neighborhood, arriving at the door days or weeks after the telegram. After they already knew. History has no record of how many families had to read those letters. But it has preserved some of what those letters contained, and the weight of them is almost unbearable. Staff Sergeant Eugene Lawton of Pennsylvania stormed the beaches of Normandy on June 6, 1944. Months later, he wrote home to describe it. He wrote that he had stood on the deck of his ship in the hours before the landings and understood with complete clarity that he was watching history being made, that the children who would one day read about this in school were not yet born, and that he had the privilege of being present. He wrote that he was proud. He was killed in Belgium during the Battle of the Bulge. His letter arrived home after he did not. That is the particular cruelty of correspondence in wartime. The letter travels at the speed of the postal system. The news of a man's death travels faster, and so families received them in the wrong order, the living voice arriving after the silence had already settled in. The men and women of the Army Effects Bureau knew this. They understood that what they were handling was not simply property. It was the last chapter of a life, arriving in pieces. Consider what came through those doors in Kansas City. A soldier from Iowa who had been carrying a pressed flower. His girl had tucked it into the lining of his kit before he shipped out. A Marine from Georgia with a photograph of his children in his shirt pocket, the edges worn smooth from being taken out and looked at. A sailor who had been halfway through a letter to his mother when his ship was hit, the letter unfinished, the words stopping mid-sentence. A paratrooper who had carried a small New Testament through North Africa, Sicily, Italy, and France, its cover cracked and its pages swollen with humidity, its margins filled with penciled notes in a handwriting his family would have recognized anywhere. Each of these objects passed through the hands of the Bureau's workers. Each was cataloged, each was packed with care, each was sent home. What those families received was not much, measured in weight or volume. A small parcel, a typed inventory, a covering letter from the Effects Bureau, formal and respectful, explaining the contents. But it was everything. It was proof that the Army had not simply left their son or husband or father on a distant hillside and moved on. It was proof that someone somewhere had picked up what he had been carrying and made sure it found its way to the people who loved him. The Graves Registration Service, the soldiers whose specific duty was to recover the fallen, identify them, and process everything that remained, worked under conditions that history has largely overlooked. They followed behind the advancing front lines, into the wreckage of battles just concluded. They worked in heat and cold and mud, and the aftermath of violence, doing a job that required both physical endurance and an almost inconceivable steadiness of spirit. They recovered hundreds of thousands of American dead across North Africa, Sicily, Italy, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Germany, and across every island campaign in the Pacific. The regulations that governed their work ran to hundreds of pages. The emotional weight of it had no pages at all. These were men who understood better than almost anyone else what the war was costing. They saw it in the most direct terms possible, and yet they kept meticulous records. They preserved the small objects. They forwarded the paperwork. They made the system work day after day, so that a mother in Ohio or a wife in Alabama or a father in Oregon would receive that brown parcel on a Tuesday and know that her boy had been looked after, even at the end. There is a documented account from a soldier who survived the war and wrote home to the mother of his closest friend, a friend who had been killed. He wanted her to know, he wrote, that her son had been carrying her last letter in his pocket when he died, that he had read it more than once, that it had meant everything to him out there. The woman had written an ordinary letter. She had probably written about the weather, about the neighborhood, about small ordinary things. She had no way of knowing it would be the last thing he read. She had no way of knowing that the army would eventually send it back to her, her own words, returned, tucked inside a brown parcel from Kansas City. In the years after the war, more than 171,000 American families chose to have their fallen soldiers brought back to the United States for burial, a program the government called, with quiet dignity, the return of the dead. The logistics of it were enormous, but the personal effects had already made that journey. They had come home first. The Army Effects Bureau closed its wartime operations when the war ended. The Graves Registration Service was eventually redesignated. The clerks went back to their lives. The warehouse in Kansas City became something else. But the parcels had already been delivered. In attics and shoeboxes and cedar chests across the United States, in houses that have long since changed hands and families that have grown and scattered over 8 decades, those objects still exist. A wallet, a photograph, a letter stopped mid-sentence, a Bible with penciled notes in the margins. The things a young man carried through the worst years of the 20th century, across oceans he had never expected to cross, into a war that asked everything of him. He left them behind. Someone made sure they came home. That was the promise the Army made, not in the headlines, not in the newsreels, but in brown paper parcels, tied with string, delivered on a Tuesday. It was the quietest promise of the war, and the one that mattered most to the people waiting at home. The names of the men and women who kept that promise are mostly forgotten now, but the things they carried, the objects they cataloged and laundered and packed with care, those still exist, tucked away in the houses of the people who waited. Proof that no American soldier, in the accounting that mattered most, was ever truly left behind.